In Timber Falls, Colorado, a Vietnam War veteran was about to face something far worse than enemy fire. A routine trip to Hayden's Hardware turned deadly serious when store manager Derek Hayden and a group of snickering teenagers decided to mock an old soldier buying porch brackets. Frank, Doc, Mallory wasn't your typical weekend customer. For 13 months, he was a combat medic with the 101st Airborne in Vietnam, known for treating 47 wounded soldiers in a single night under heavy enemy fire at Firebase Charlie, near Dakto. When Derek called him a boomer and dismissed his service as ancient history, they had no idea they were being watched by Steven Seagal himself. The martial arts legend responded not with violence, but with devastating truths and unshakable moral authority that would trigger a community-wide reckoning. What began as cruel generational mockery would become a lesson in respect and redemption. The small mountain hardware store would never be the same after Seagal reminded everyone that heroes walk among us, and some battles are won with character, not fists. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street in Timber Falls, Colorado, painting the storefronts in warm golden hues. At 9:30 a.m., the small mountain town was already alive with its familiar rhythm. Pickup trucks rumbling past, locals nodding to each other on sidewalks, and the distant sound of hammering from the construction site down by the old mill. The air carried the crisp scent of pine and the promise of another beautiful summer day in the Rockies. Hayden's Hardware and Supply sat at the corner of Main and Pine, its red brick facade weathered but welcoming. The store had been a fixture in Timber Falls for over 40 years, serving as more than just a place to buy tools and supplies. It was a gathering spot where locals caught up on gossip, shared advice on weekend projects, and maintained the invisible threads that bound the community together. Frank, Doc, Mallory pushed through the front door, the familiar chime of the bell announcing his arrival. At 73, Frank moved with the deliberate care of a man who'd learned that rushing only led to pain. His wooden cane, carved from mountain ash, tapped softly against the worn wooden floors as he made his way inside. The faded army cap on his silver head bore the insignia of the 101st Airborne, its edges softened by decades of handling. "Morning, Doc," called Maya Collins from behind the counter, looking up from her college textbook with a genuine smile. At 22, Maya had been working part-time at the hardware store for 3 years, helping to support her family while pursuing her degree in education. Her grandfather had served in Vietnam too, and she'd grown up hearing stories that made her appreciate men like Frank in ways her peers couldn't quite understand. "Morning, Maya," Frank replied, his weathered face creasing into a warm smile. "How's that psychology class treating you?" "Oh, you know how it is," she laughed, closing the thick textbook. "Professor thinks we need to understand the human mind, but I figure working here teaches me more about people than any classroom ever could." Frank chuckled, adjusting his grip on the cane. "Your grandfather always said the same thing. Smart man, your grandpa. One of the finest radio operators I knew in Nam." Maya's eyes softened at the mention of her grandfather. She'd been only 12 when he passed, but she remembered the way he'd light up whenever Frank visited, the two old soldiers sharing stories and comfortable silences that spoke of shared experiences beyond words. "Working on the porch again today?" Maya asked, already knowing the answer. Frank's weekend projects had become legendary in their modest scope and meticulous execution. "Those bottom steps need reinforcing before the rain season hits," Frank explained, scanning the store's layout. "Need some new L brackets, maybe some galvanized screws. Nothing fancy." The store buzzed with its usual Saturday morning activity. Near the paint section, Hector Alvarez examined color samples with the focused intensity of a man who'd learned that the wrong shade could haunt you for years. The local contractor had been coming to Hayden's since he was a teenager, back when Derek's father ran the place with the kind of steady authority that made every customer feel valued. By the front window, old Mr. Richmond sat in his usual spot, Walker parked beside him, regaling anyone who'd listen with stories about the base he'd caught at Silver Lake. At 86, Richmond was one of the few World War II veterans left in town, and his presence in the store had become as much a fixture as the cash register. "That bass was this big," Richmond was saying, spreading his arthritic hands wide for the benefit of two teenage customers browsing the fishing gear. Of course, that was back when the lake wasn't all fished out by city folks with their fancy boats. Jason and Brianna, both 17 and more interested in their phones than fishing wisdom, nodded politely while texting. But there was something endearing about their patience with the old man, a respect that suggested timber falls still raised. It's young people, right? From the back office came the sound of Derek Hayden's voice, loud and animated as he talked on his phone. At 28, Derek had inherited the store after his father's sudden heart attack 2 years ago, and the transition hadn't been smooth. Where his father had possessed an easy warmth that made customers feel like family, Derek seemed perpetually busy, always looking over shoulders towards something more important than the person in front of him. No, no, Derek was saying as he emerged from the office, phone pressed to his ear. I told you we need the whole order by Wednesday. These old-timers don't understand that we've got systems now, tracking inventory, digital everything. They can't just wander in expecting us to have everything sitting on the shelf like we're still in 1985. Maya glanced toward Frank, hoping he hadn't heard, but the slight tightening around the old man's eyes suggested he had. Frank had been shopping at Hayden's since before Derek was born, back when the store was half its current size, and old man Hayden knew every customer's name, their kids' names, and what projects they were working on. Let me help you find those brackets, Doc, Maya said quickly, stepping out from behind the counter. I think we got a new shipment of the heavy-duty ones yesterday. As they walked toward the hardware section, Frank's cane tapped a steady rhythm against the floor. The sound seemed to echo in the space, drawing glances from other customers. Some nodded respectfully. Hector raised his hand in a small wave. Mr. Richmond called out a greeting, but others, particularly the younger customers, seemed to see only an old man moving slowly through their Saturday morning. Take your time, Doc, Maya said softly as Frank examined the various brackets on display. No rush at all. Derek finished his phone call and surveyed the store with the air of a man trying to project authority. His carefully styled hair and designer jeans stood out against the practical surroundings, giving him the appearance of someone playing dress-up in someone else's life. He watched Frank's slow, methodical selection process with barely concealed impatience. Maya, can you help Mrs. Patterson with the garden hoses? Derek called out, his voice carrying an edge of irritation. Some of us have schedules to keep. The comment wasn't directed at Frank, but it landed nonetheless. Maya shot Derek a disapproving look, but dutifully went to help the woman examining irrigation supplies. Frank continued his careful examination of the brackets, his movements unchanged but somehow more deliberate, as if he were consciously refusing to be hurried. The morning continued with its familiar rhythms, but underneath the pleasant small-town atmosphere, tension simmered like water just before it boils. Derek's impatience grew more visible with each passing minute, his glances toward Frank becoming more frequent and less subtle. The stage was set for something more than a simple Saturday morning hardware store visit. In the distance, the church bells chimed 10 o'clock, marking the passage of time in a town where time moved differently for different generations. And somewhere between the patient browsing of an old soldier and the restless energy of a young man trying to prove himself, the morning was about to take an unexpected turn. By 11 o'clock, Hayden's hardware had filled with the usual Saturday crowd. The store hummed with conversations about weekend projects, friendly debates over the best way to fix a leaky faucet, and the comfortable chaos of a community gathering place. But beneath the surface pleasantries, Derek's mood had darkened like storm clouds gathering over the mountains. Frank had been examining brackets for 20 minutes, his arthritic fingers carefully turning each package to read the specifications. What younger customers accomplished in 30 seconds took Frank several minutes, but his thoroughness came from hard-earned experience. In Vietnam, the difference between the right equipment and the wrong equipment could mean the difference between life and death. That attention to detail had saved lives then, and it served him well now in smaller, quieter battles against gravity and time. You know what? Derek said to Jason and Brianna, his voice carrying just loud enough for nearby customers to hear. I swear some people treat this place like it's a museum instead of a business. The teenagers looked up from their phones, suddenly interested in the drama unfolding. Derek had their attention now, and he felt the familiar rush of being the center of focus. It was a feeling he'd chased since taking over the store, trying to fill the void left by his father's natural charisma. I mean, look at this, Derek continued, gesturing subtly toward Frank. Same routine every Saturday. Takes an hour to buy $5 worth of screws, then wants to tell you his whole life story while you're trying to help paying customers. Jason, 17 and eager to be included in adult conversations, snickered. My dad says old people just don't understand that time is money. Exactly, Derek said, warming to his theme. Like, I get it, they're lonely or whatever, but some of us have actual businesses to run. We've got computerized inventory online, ordering modern systems. But they want to shop like it's still 1975. Brianna shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward Frank. Something about the conversation felt wrong to her, though she couldn't quite articulate why. Her own grandmother had raised her while her parents worked, and she'd learned patience from watching the old woman navigate a world that seemed to move faster every day. Derek, emboldened by his audience, began to mimic Frank's careful movements. He hunched his shoulders, adopted an exaggerated limp, and pretended to examine a package with theatrical confusion. Oh my, this newfangled bracket technology is so complicated, he said in a mocking voice. Back in my day, we held everything, together with spit and prayer. The teenagers laughed nervously, the sound carrying across the store. Several customers turned to look, their expressions ranging from amusement to concern. Maya, helping a customer with paint samples, glanced over with growing alarm. This was crossing a line, and she knew it. Frank, despite his age and the ambient noise of the store, had heard enough to understand what was happening. He'd been mocked before, by young doctors who saw only an old man in the emergency room, by clerks who spoke loudly and slowly as if age had stolen his intelligence, by strangers who saw his cane and assumed incompetence. But this was different. This was public, deliberate, and cruel. He continued examining the brackets, his movements unchanged, but something shifted in his posture. The dignity that had carried him through 13 months in Vietnam, through the loss of friends, through the quiet heroism of saving lives under fire, seemed to gather around him like armor. He would not give Derek the satisfaction of a reaction. Oh, and don't get me started on the war stories, Derek continued, his voice growing bolder. Every single trip, it's back in Vietnam this and back in Vietnam that. Like, dude, that was like 50 years ago. Move on. This time, the laughter was more forced. Even Jason looked uncomfortable, sensing that Derek had moved beyond good-natured ribbing into something meaner. Mr. Richmond, still sitting by the window, had stopped talking mid-sentence, his weathered hands gripping his walker with white knuckles. Hector Alvarez, examining with stain in the next aisle, stepped around the corner with the expression of barely controlled anger. Derek, he said quietly, his voice carrying the warning tone of a man who'd seen his share of fights. Maybe you ought to dial it back a notch. Oh, come on, Hector, Derek replied, his confidence boosted by the teenager's presence. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. These old guys come in here acting like they own the place, expecting special treatment because they did their thing back in the day. But this is 2024, not 1969. The world's moved on. The store had grown quieter, conversations dying as customers became aware of the tension. Maya abandoned her customer and moved closer, her face flushed with embarrassment for her boss and anger at his words. Derek, that's enough, she said firmly. Mr. Mallory is a customer, and he deserves respect. Respect? Derek laughed, but it was a hollow sound. Respect is earned, Maya. And what has he done lately besides slow down my store and bore everyone with stories about the good old days? Frank finally looked up from the brackets, his pale blue eyes meeting Derek's with a steadiness that had once intimidated enemy soldiers. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear, carrying the authority of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to command attention. I'm just trying to fix up my porch steps, Frank said simply. Don't need any special treatment. Just need the right parts to do the job right. The simplicity of his words, the complete absence of defensiveness or anger, somehow made Derek's behavior appear even more petty. Several customers exchanged glances, and Maya felt her cheeks burn, with shame for her employer. But Derek, perhaps sensing that he'd gone too far, but unable to back down in front of his audience, doubled down on his cruelty. Right, the porch steps. Let me guess. You're going to tell me about how you built bunkers in Vietnam, and these steps are basically the same thing, right? The silence that followed was pregnant with tension. Even the teenagers had stopped smiling, recognizing that they were witnessing something they shouldn't be part of. Jason's phone, which had been casually recording the interaction for social media, suddenly felt heavy in his hand. Frank set down the package of brackets with deliberate care, his movements precise despite the slight tremor in his hands. I was a medic, he said quietly. Didn't build bunkers. Just tried to patch up boys who were hurt and scared, long way from home. The words hung in the air like a rebuke, simple and devastating. Derek's face flushed red, but instead of backing down, he seemed to hear the quiet dignity in Frank's voice as a challenge to his authority. Right, a medic, Derek said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Let me guess, you saved a bunch of lives, got some medals, came home a hero. And now you expect everyone to bow down and kiss your feet because you had one job 50 years ago. The cruelty of the words shocked even Derek himself, but he was too far committed to retreat. The store had gone completely silent now, the only sounds the hum of the air conditioning and the distant rumble of traffic outside. Frank's face showed no anger, no hurt, no reaction at all. He simply nodded once, as if Derek had confirmed something he'd already known. I expect to buy some brackets and go home, he said. Nothing more. As Frank spoke, the front door chimed softly, and a new customer entered the store. The man was in his early 70s, dressed in simple jeans and a flannel shirt, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades training his body to be a precise instrument. He paused just inside the door, his alert eyes taking in the scene with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to reading dangerous situations. Steven Seagal had arrived in Timber Falls to teach a weekend Aikido seminar at the local recreation center. He'd entered the hardware store looking for nothing more than a few supplies for his hotel room repairs. But as he stood in the doorway, watching a young man publicly humiliate an old soldier, he recognized something that demanded his attention. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not just Derek's cruelty, but the entire community's willingness to stand by and watch as one of their own was torn down by ignorance and arrogance. Steven Seagal moved through the store with the unhurried grace of a man who had learned that true awareness required patience. His weathered hands selected a few basic items, a small level, some sandpaper, a package of screws, while his eyes cataloged everything happening around him. To the casual observer, he was just another weekend customer, but 30 years of martial arts training and countless situations where reading people meant the difference between life and death had honed his instincts to a razor's edge. The tension in the store was palpable, hanging in the air like humidity before a thunderstorm. Derek stood near the register, still basking in the attention of the teenagers, while Frank examined brackets with the methodical precision of a man who refused to be hurried despite the obvious hostility directed at him. The other customers seemed frozen in place, uncertain whether to intervene or pretend they hadn't witnessed the cruelty. Seagal moved closer to the hardware section, his soft-soled boots making no sound on the wooden floor. As he passed Frank, their eyes met for just a moment, a brief exchange that said more than words ever could. In that instant, two men who had served their country in different ways and different times recognized each other. Frank's slight nod carried the weight of shared understanding, while Seagal's calm presence seemed to offer silent support. You, finding everything you need? Maya asked Seagal, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining normal customer service in an increasingly abnormal situation. Yes, thank you, Seagal replied, his voice soft but carrying clearly through the store. There was something in his tone, not threatening, but absolutely certain, that made several customers turn to look at him more closely. Derek, still riding the wave of his perceived dominance, noticed the exchange. Another satisfied customer, he said loudly, his voice carrying false cheerfulness. See, Maya? Some people know how to shop efficiently. In and out, no drama, no 20-minute debates over basic hardware. Seagal continued browsing, seemingly oblivious to Derek's pointed comments, but his awareness extended to every corner of the store. He noticed the way Mr. Richmond gripped his walker, the old soldier's knuckles white with suppressed anger. He saw how Hector Alvarez had moved protectively closer to Frank, the contractor's body language screaming readiness for confrontation. Most importantly, he observed the way Frank carried himself, the straight spine despite the cane, the careful dignity, the absolute refusal to be diminished by another man's smallness. You know what I love about running a modern business? Derek continued, his voice growing more confident as he played to his audience. We serve customers who understand that time is money. Not like the old days when people would just hang around all day, treating the store like some kind of social club. Jason shifted uncomfortably, his phone still recording, but his enthusiasm for the situation rapidly fading. What had started as amusing had become uncomfortable, and he was beginning to understand that he might be documenting something he'd rather not be part of. Seagal picked up a small screwdriver, testing its weight with the unconscious precision of someone who evaluated every tool for its potential effectiveness. His movements were economical, purposeful, but never rushed. In the world he came from, hurrying meant missing details, and missed details could be fatal. "Excuse me," Frank said quietly, approaching Maya with a package of brackets. "I think these will work for what I need." Maya smiled with genuine relief. "Of course, Mr. Mallory. Will that be cash or card today?" "Cash," Frank replied, reaching for his wallet with careful movements. His fingers, marked by old scars and swollen with arthritis, fumbled slightly with the bills. Derek watched the transaction with obvious impatience, tapping his fingers on the counter. "You know, we do take cards," he said loudly. "Much faster than counting out exact change. Welcome to the 21st century." The comment was unnecessary and cruel, designed to highlight Frank's age and supposed inability to adapt to modern convenience. Several customers winced at the obvious meanness, but still no one spoke up. Seagal set down his items and moved closer to the counter, his presence somehow changing the dynamic of the space. He wasn't doing anything threatening, just standing there, waiting his turn, but something about his stillness commanded attention. Derek glanced at him nervously, then looked away, suddenly uncertain. "Will that be all for you today, Mr. Mallory?" Maya asked, her voice deliberately warm as she bagged Frank's purchase. "Yes, thank you, Maya," Frank replied. "Tell your mother I asked about her. Hope her garden's doing well this year." "I will," Maya said, her smile genuine. She always says her tomatoes grow better when you ask about them. The simple exchange of neighborly concern stood in stark contrast to Derek's performance, highlighting the difference between genuine community connection and hollow posturing. Derek seemed to sense this, his face flushing with embarrassment that quickly transformed into renewed anger. "Real heartwarming," Derek muttered, just loud enough to be heard. "Maybe next time you can discuss her whole family tree while the rest of us wait in line." Seagal stepped forward then, not aggressively, but with the fluid movement of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of positioning. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice soft but carrying an undertone that made everyone in the store turn to look at him. Derek straightened, trying to project authority he didn't feel. "No problem at all," he said, his voice artificially bright. "Just helping customers understand that we run an efficient operation here. Some people get that, some people don't." "I see," Seagal replied, his pale eyes steady on Derek's face. The silence that followed stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, filled with the weight of unspoken communication. Frank, recognizing the potential for the situation to escalate, moved toward the door. "Thank you for your help, Maya," he said quietly. "I'll see you next week." But as Frank walked away, Derek couldn't resist one final demonstration of his perceived power. "Hey, try not to take all day on those porch steps," he called out. "Some of us have actual schedules to keep." The comment was gratuitous, a parting shot designed to remind everyone who was in charge. But instead of solidifying Derek's dominance, it accomplished the opposite. The cruelty was so naked, so unnecessary, that even his teenage audience looked away in embarrassment. Seagal watched Frank's retreating figure, noting the way the old man's shoulders tensed slightly but never dropped, the way his stride remained steady despite the public humiliation. When he turned back to Derek, his expression was unchanged, calm, centered, but somehow more intense. "Interesting approach to customer service," Seagal said quietly. Derek laughed, but it sounded forced. "Look, I don't know who you are, but this is my store, and I know how to run it. Maybe wherever you're from, They do things differently, but here we believe in efficiency. I'm from a lot of places, Seagal replied, his voice still soft but carrying implications that made Derek's confidence waver. But everywhere I've been, respect for elders is considered a sign of civilization. The words hung in the air like a challenge, simple and direct. Derek's face flushed red, caught between backing down and doubling down on his cruelty. The store had gone silent again, every customer aware that they were witnessing something significant. Telling and preparing. This story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Maya gripped the counter, her knuckles white. Hector took a step closer, his contractor's build suddenly looking more intimidating. Even the teenagers seemed to sense that the stakes had changed, that this wasn't just about an old man buying brackets anymore. The confrontation was about to begin in earnest, and everyone in Hayden's hardware knew it. The silence in the store stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Derek stood behind the counter, his carefully styled hair now slightly disheveled, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. The weight of Seagal's steady gaze seemed to press down on him, making the simple task of maintaining eye contact feel like an impossible challenge. "Look," Derek said, his voice climbing higher than he intended. "I don't know what your deal is, but you don't know anything about this town or how things work here. That old man comes in here every week, takes up my time, expects special treatment because he's a veteran. Well, newsflash, everyone's got a sob story. This is a business, not a charity." Frank had paused near the door, his hand on the handle, clearly hoping to escape before the situation deteriorated further. But Derek's words reached him, and something in the casual dismissal of his service, the reduction of 13 months of hell to a sob story, made him turn back. "I never asked for special treatment," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of absolute truth. "Just asked for brackets. Right?" Derek sneered, emboldened by what he perceived as Frank's weakness. "Just brackets. But it's never just brackets, is it? It's always some long story about Vietnam, about how tough you had it, about how much you sacrificed. Well, guess what? That war ended 50 years ago. Time to move on." The words hit the store like a physical blow. Mr. Richmond struggled to his feet, his walker scraping against the floor as he maneuvered toward the counter. Hector's face darkened, with anger, his hands clenching into fists. Even Jason lowered his phone, suddenly understanding that he was recording something that would have consequences beyond a few likes on social media. "That's enough," Maya said firmly, her voice shaking with emotion. "Mr. Mallory has been nothing but kind to everyone in this store. He's never complained, never demanded anything, never been anything but respectful. You're being cruel, Derek, and you're embarrassing yourself." Derek's face flushed redder, but instead of backing down, he seemed to double down on his cruelty. "Embarrassing myself? I'm embarrassing myself? I'm trying to run a business here, and you want me to coddle every old-timer who wants to relive his glory days? This isn't a museum, Maya. This isn't a therapy session. This is a hardware store." "A hardware store your father built on treating people with dignity," Hector said, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years of friendship with the elder Hayden. "Your dad would be ashamed of what you're doing right now." The mention of his father hit Derek like a slap. His face contorted with a mixture of pain and rage, all his insecurities about living up to his father's legacy suddenly exposed. "Don't you dare bring my father into this," he snarled. "My father ran this place when times were different. But this is my store now, and I make the rules." "Your father made customers feel welcome," Mr. Richmond said, his voice quavering but determined. He understood that respect goes both ways. "This young man here," he gestured toward Frank, "saved my nephew's life in Vietnam. Carried him 2 miles through enemy territory with a bullet in his own leg. You think that's a sob story?" Derek's composure cracked entirely. "I don't care what he did in Vietnam," he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. "That was 50 years ago. What has he done lately? What has any of you done lately besides sit around talking about the good old days and expecting everyone to bow down to you?" The store erupted in shocked murmurs. Several customers headed for the door, unwilling to witness any more of the ugly scene. But others moved closer, drawn by the train wreck fascination of watching someone destroy themselves in public. Frank stood perfectly still, his face showing no emotion, but his knuckles were white where he gripped his cane. In all his years of dealing with prejudice and dismissal, he'd never encountered such naked contempt for his service and sacrifice. "You want to know what he's done lately?" Seagal said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. The store fell silent. Immediately, every eye turning to the quiet man who had been observing the scene with increasing intensity. Derek turned to face Seagal, his face twisted with anger and frustration. "Oh, great. Another old-timer ready to lecture me about respect. Let me guess. You're going to tell me about how tough you had it too, right? How I should be grateful for your service? I'm going to tell you about character," Seagal replied, his voice soft but carrying absolute authority. "About the difference between a man who's earned his place in the world and a boy who inherited his." The words were delivered without anger, without raised voice, but they hit Derek like a physical blow. His face went pale, then flushed red. Again, as the implication sank in. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Derek demanded, his voice cracking with emotion. "You come into my store, you don't know anything about me or my situation, and you think you can judge me? You think you can tell me how to run my business?" "I think I can recognize a man who's forgotten what his father taught him," Seagal replied calmly. "If he taught you anything at all about treating people with dignity." Derek's last shred of control snapped. My father, my father, my father," he screamed. "I'm sick of hearing about my father. He's dead, okay? He's been dead for 2 years, and I've been trying to keep this place running while everyone compares me to him every single day. You want to know what he taught me? He taught me that nice guys finish last. He taught me that if you're too nice to people, they'll walk all over you. That's not what your father taught you," Maya said quietly, tears streaming down her face. "Your father taught you that kindness is strength, not weakness. He taught you that a business is only as good as the community it serves. He taught you that respect is earned by giving it, not demanding it." Derek stared at her, his chest heaving with emotion. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, recognition, perhaps, or regret. But then his face hardened again, and he turned back to Frank. "You know what? I'm done with this conversation," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You want your brackets? Buy them and get out. But don't expect me to kiss your feet because you did your job 50 years ago. The world doesn't owe you anything, old man. None of us owe you anything." The words hung in the air like poison, toxic and corrosive. Frank looked at Derek for a long moment, his pale blue eyes reflecting a sadness that went deeper than personal hurt. He was seeing something die, the last connection to the store where he'd been welcomed for decades, the final severing of ties to a community that had once valued what he'd given. "You're right," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of resignation. "The world doesn't owe me anything. I never expected it to." He turned toward the door, his movement slow and deliberate, carrying the dignity of a man who had faced worse than this and survived. But as he reached for the handle, Derek's voice stopped him one last time. "And don't bother coming back," Derek called out. "Find somewhere else to shop, somewhere that caters to people living in the past." The cruelty of the words, the absolute, unnecessary venom, galvanized the store. Mr. Richmond banged his walker against the floor, his face red with rage. Hector stepped forward, his fists clenched, ready to settle the matter in the traditional way. Even Brianna, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, looked ready to speak up. But it was Seagal who moved first, stepping between Derek and Frank with the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of controlled movement. His presence seemed to fill the space, and when he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had never needed to raise it to command attention. "That's where you're wrong," he said simply. "The world owes him everything, and it's time you learned why." The confrontation was about to enter a new phase, one that would test not just Derek's arrogance, but the entire community's willingness to stand up for what was right. The store held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The store seemed to hold its breath as Steven Seagal stood between Derek and Frank, his presence radiating a calm authority that made everyone acutely aware they were witnessing something extraordinary. His words, "The world owes him everything, and it's time you learned why," hung in the air like a promise and a warning rolled into one. Derek, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment, tried to regain control of the situation. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, coming into my store, and I know exactly who I am," Seagal interrupted, his voice soft but carrying an undertone that made Derek's words die in his throat. The question is, do you know who you are? The simple question, delivered without aggression or theatrics, somehow carried more weight than any shouted threat could have. Derek opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, suddenly uncertain. There was something about this stranger that he couldn't quite place, a quality of stillness that seemed to contain immense potential energy, like a coiled spring waiting to be released. I asked you a question, Seagal continued, taking a single step closer to Derek. The movement was unhurried, almost casual, but it changed the entire dynamic of the space. Do you know who you are? I'm the manager of this store, Derek said, his voice wavering slightly. I'm the owner. This is my business. That's what you do, Seagal replied calmly. That's not who you are. Try again. The philosophical nature of the challenge caught Derek off guard. He'd been prepared for threats, for physical confrontation, for the kind of masculine posturing he understood. But this quiet dissection of his identity was something else entirely. I don't have to explain myself to you, Derek said, but his voice lacked conviction. You're just another customer. You buy something or you leave. Seagal smiled slightly, an expression that didn't reach his eyes. I'm not just another customer, Derek. I'm someone who recognizes the difference between strength and weakness. And right now, you're showing me weakness. The words were delivered without malice, stated as simple fact, but they hit Derek like a physical blow. Around the store, customers watched in fascination as the young manager seemed to shrink under the older man's steady gaze. You want to see weakness? Derek snarled, his composure finally cracking completely. Weakness is coming in here every week, moving like a cripple, expecting everyone to feel sorry for you because you fought in some war nobody even remembers. Weakness is living in the past instead of dealing with the present. The ugly words spilled out of Derek like poison from a wound, revealing the depth of his resentment and insecurity. Several customers gasped audibly, and Maya covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her face. Seagal listened to the outburst with the patience of someone who had heard similar words before, who understood that anger often masked fear and pain. When Derek finished, the silence that followed was deafening. You're right about one thing, Seagal said quietly. There is weakness in this room, but you're looking in the wrong direction. He turned slightly, addressing the entire store rather than just Derek. This man, he gestured toward Frank, spent 13 months in Vietnam as a combat medic. Do you know what that means? It means that while other soldiers were trained to take lives, he was trained to save them. It means he ran toward gunfire while others ran away from it. It means he carried wounded boys, some of them younger than you, Derek, to safety while bullets whined past his head. Frank shifted uncomfortably near the door and used to being the center of attention, uncomfortable with praise for actions he'd always considered simply his duty. But he remained silent, recognizing that something larger than his personal discomfort was unfolding. At Firebase Charlie, near Dakto, Seagal continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had done his research, who understood the weight of history. This man treated 47 wounded soldiers in a single night. When the medevac choppers couldn't land due to enemy fire, he kept men alive with nothing but his hands and his training and his refusal to let them die. Derek's face had gone pale, the color draining from his cheeks as the reality of Frank's service became clear. Around the store, customers who had known Frank for years were learning details of his heroism for the first time, understanding that the quiet old man they'd taken for granted had once held the line between life and death for America's sons. He earned 2 bronze stars and a silver star, Seagal said, his voice never rising but somehow filling every corner of the store. He saved lives that night that went on to become fathers, teachers, doctors, mechanics. Men who built families and communities and made the world better. Some of those men might have been your neighbors, Derek. Some of them might have been your friends. The weight of this revelation settled over the store like a blanket. Jason had lowered his phone completely, his face pale with the understanding that he'd been laughing at a genuine American hero. Brianna wiped tears from her eyes, thinking of her own grandfather and the stories he'd never told. But you want to know the most remarkable thing about Frank Mallory? Seagal asked, his pale eyes fixed on Derek's face. He came home from that hell, and he spent the next 50 years serving his community. He volunteered as an EMT. He coached Little League. He helped build the playground at the elementary school with his own hands. He's been a pallbearer at dozens of funerals for men who never came home because their families needed someone who understood. Derek seemed to shrink with each word, the full weight of his ignorance and cruelty becoming clear. He'd spent years resenting Frank's quiet presence, seeing it as a reminder of his own inadequacy, never understanding that he was in the presence of genuine greatness. So when you ask what he's done lately, Seagal said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, the answer is simple. He's lived with dignity. He's carried wounds you can't see and pain you can't imagine, and he's done it without complaint, without asking for recognition, without expecting anything in return except basic human decency. The store was silent, except for the soft sound of Maya's crying and the distant hum of the air conditioning. Derek stood behind his counter like a man facing judgment, his earlier arrogance replaced by something that looked very much like shame. "And you," Seagal said, turning his full attention back to Derek, "you called that weakness." The accusation hung in the air like an indictment. Derek opened his mouth to respond, to defend himself, to explain away his actions, but no words came. For the first time in his life, he was confronting the true cost of his cruelty, seeing himself reflected in the eyes of a man who understood the difference between strength and weakness in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. Frank stood by the door, his weathered hands gripping his cane, watching a young man learn lessons that should have been taught long ago. There was no satisfaction in Derek's humiliation, no joy in seeing him brought low. There was only sadness for the waste of it all, for the pain that could have been avoided if someone had taught Derek to recognize the heroes walking among him. The confrontation was far from over, but the first crucial blow had been struck. Derek's facade of authority had been stripped away, revealing the frightened, insecure young man beneath. Now came the harder part, deciding what kind of man he would choose to become when faced with the truth about himself. In the aftermath of Seagal's devastating revelation about Frank's service, the hardware store seemed to reorganize itself along invisible lines of loyalty and conscience. The silence that had followed Seagal's words gradually gave way to murmurs, shifting feet, and the sound of customers making choices about where they stood, literally and figuratively. Hector Alvarez was the first to move. The contractor stepped forward, his weathered hands removing his baseball cap as he approached Frank. "Sir," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I owe you my leg. Hell, I owe you my life. When that beam fell on me at the Morrison construction site 15 years ago, you were the first one there. You kept me conscious, kept me calm until the paramedics arrived. The doctor said later that if I'd gone into shock, I might not have made it." Frank's face softened with recognition. "Little Hector," he said quietly, "you were just a kid then. Look at you now. Got your own business, raised a fine family. Because of you," Hector said firmly. "Because you knew what to do when it mattered." He turned to face Derek, his expression hard. "This man is a hero, Derek. A real one. And you just tried to throw him out of the store like he was trash." Derek's face cycled through emotions, shame, anger, defensiveness, as he struggled to process the magnitude of his mistake. I didn't know," he stammered. "Nobody ever told me about." "Because he's not the type to brag about it," interrupted Mr. Richmond, who had maneuvered his walker closer to the group. His voice quavered with age but carried the weight of authority. "Real heroes don't spend their time telling war stories, boy. They just do what needs doing and move on with their lives." Maya stepped out from behind the counter, her face streaked with tears but her voice steady. "Mr. Mallory helped my family when my dad lost his job 3 years ago," she said, addressing the store but looking directly at Derek. "Anonymous gift card to the grocery store, paid our electric bill for 2 months. We never knew who it was until my mom saw him talking to the manager at the power company. When she tried to thank him, he just said neighbors help neighbors." The testimonials were building momentum, each story adding weight to the growing understanding of who Frank really was. Jason, the teenager who had been laughing at Derek's mockery just minutes before, looked sick with shame. His phone hung, forgotten in his hand, the video he'd been recording now feeling like evidence of his own moral failure. "Dude," he whispered to Brianna, "I was laughing at him. I was actually laughing at him." Brianna nodded, her own face pale with remorse. My grandpa always said the real heroes never talk about what they did. I thought he was just being dramatic. Your grandfather was a wise man. Came a new voice from near the paint section. An elderly woman in gardening clothes stepped forward, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I'm Dorothy Chun. My husband was wounded at Firebase Charlie, same night. Mr. Mallory earned his silver star. Tommy came home because of men like him. We had 43 years together, raised 3 children, saw 7 grandchildren born. All because this man did his job when bullets were flying and good men were dying. The weight of collective testimony was overwhelming. Derek found himself at the center of a community that was discovering its own shame, recognizing that they had allowed one of their genuine heroes to be humiliated in public. But more than that, they were seeing Derek clearly for perhaps the first time, not as the successful young businessman he pretended to be, but as a small, petty man who had inherited something precious and was systematically destroying it. "This is ridiculous," Derek said, his voice cracking with desperation. "You're all acting like I committed some kind of crime. I run a business here. I can't be expected to know everyone's life story. I can't give special treatment to every old guy who walks through that door." "Nobody asked for special treatment," Frank said quietly, speaking for the first time since Seagal's intervention. "I just wanted to buy brackets and go home." The simplicity of the statement, the complete absence of self-pity or accusation, somehow made Derek's behavior appear even more inexcusable. Several customers shook their heads in disgust, and Maya felt fresh tears spill down her cheeks. "Frank's right," said a voice from the back of the store. A middle-aged woman in business attire stepped forward, her expression stern. "I'm Susan Martinez. I run the insurance office down the street. I've been watching this whole thing, and I have to say, Derek, your father would be ashamed of you right now." The mention of his father hit Derek like a physical blow, bringing color to his pale cheeks. "Don't you dare bring my father into this," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Your father built this store on respect," Susan continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had known the Hayden family for decades. "He understood that a business is only as strong as the community it serves. He would never have treated a customer the way you just treated Mr. Mallory." "My father's dead," Derek shot back, anger replacing shame in his voice. "He's been dead for 2 years, and I've been trying to keep this place running while everyone tells me how much better he was at everything." "Well, maybe he was better. Maybe I'm just not cut out for this. Maybe I should just sell the place and move to Denver like I always wanted." The threat hung in the air like a bombshell. Hayden's Hardware wasn't just a store to the people of Timber Falls. It was a gathering place, a landmark, a symbol of community continuity. The idea of it disappearing, of being replaced by some soulless chain store, was almost unthinkable. "Is that what you want?" Seagal asked quietly, his voice cutting through the emotional chaos. "To run away? To give up on everything your father built because facing your mistakes is too hard?" Derek turned to face Seagal, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "What do you know about it? You don't know what it's like, trying to live up to someone everyone thought was perfect. You don't know what it's like to have every decision you make compared to what he would have done." "You're right," Seagal said calmly. "I don't know what that's like. But I know what it's like to have to earn respect instead of inheriting it. I know what it's like to face your failures and decide whether you're going to learn from them or let them destroy you." The confrontation had reached a crucial turning point. Derek stood at the crossroads between the man he had been and the man he might become, surrounded by a community that was watching to see which path he would choose. Jason stepped forward then, his phone finally tucked away in his pocket. "Mr. Hayden," he said, his young voice uncertain but determined. I recorded some of what happened. The stuff you said about Mr. Mallory. I was going to post it. But..." He looked around the store, seeing the faces of people he'd known his entire life. "I deleted it. But I wanted you to know that I had it. And I wanted you to know that I'm sorry I laughed." The teenager's confession and apology seemed to break something inside Derek. For the first time since the confrontation began, his carefully constructed facade cracked completely, revealing the frightened, overwhelmed young man beneath. "I don't know how to fix this," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know how to be what everyone expects me to be." The admission hung in the air like a prayer, vulnerable and desperate. Around the store, people exchanged glances, recognizing that they were witnessing a moment of genuine human breakdown, a young man finally admitting that he was lost and needed help. Maya stepped forward, her anger replaced by something softer, something that looked like hope. "Maybe you don't have to be what everyone expects," she said gently. "Maybe you just have to be decent. Maybe you just have to start treating people the way your father taught you to treat them." Derek looked at her through tears he was no longer trying to hide. "What if I've forgotten how? What if I've become someone he wouldn't recognize?" "Then you learn again," Frank said quietly, speaking from his position near the door. "That's what we do when we make mistakes. We learn. We do better." The offer of forgiveness, coming from the man who had been most wronged, seemed to offer Derek a lifeline. But whether he would be strong enough to take it remained to be seen. The store waited, holding its breath, as a young man struggled to find his way back to the man his father had hoped he would become. The confrontation inside Hayden's hardware had reached an emotional crescendo, but it was far from over. As customers began to file out, some shaking their heads in disgust, others whispering among themselves about what they'd witnessed, Derek found himself standing behind his counter like a man surveying the wreckage of his own life. The store, that had been his inheritance, his burden, and his identity, had become the stage for his public humiliation. Frank moved toward the door with quiet dignity, his cane tapping softly against the wooden floor. He'd gotten what he came for, the brackets for his porch steps, but he'd lost something too. The store where he'd shopped for decades, where he'd felt welcome and valued, had become a place where his service and sacrifice were dismissed as irrelevant relics of a forgotten war. "Mr. Mallory," Maya called out as Frank reached for the door. "Handle. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry about what happened here today." Frank turned back, his weathered face creased with something that might have been a sad smile. "Not your fault, young lady. You're a good person, Maya. Your grandfather would be proud of how you turned out." The simple kindness in his words, the complete absence of bitterness despite what he'd endured, made Maya's tears flow fresh. Around the store, the remaining customers seemed to understand that they were witnessing something rare, genuine grace under pressure, the kind of character that was forged in fire and tempered by time. Derek watched Frank's retreating figure, something churning in his chest that felt like regret mixed with panic. The finality of Frank's departure seemed to represent more than just the loss of a customer. It was the severing of a connection to the community his father had loved, the breaking of bonds that had taken decades to build. "Wait," Derek called out, his voice cracking with emotion. "Just wait." Frank paused with his hand on the door, not turning around, but clearly listening. The store fell silent again, everyone sensing that Derek was about to make a choice that would define not just this moment, but possibly the rest of his life. "I need to," Derek started, then stopped, struggling to find words for feelings he'd never learned to express. "I need to explain." "No," Seagal said quietly, his voice cutting through Derek's fumbling attempt at justification. "You need to understand. There's a difference." Derek looked at Seagal with confusion and growing frustration. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means that explaining is about making yourself feel better," Seagal replied, his pale eyes steady on Derek's face. "Understanding is about seeing clearly what you've done and why it matters. One is about you. The other is about everyone else." The distinction hit Derek like a revelation, forcing him to confront the selfishness that had driven his behavior. He'd been so focused on his own insecurities, his own fears, his own resentments, that he'd lost sight of the impact of his actions on others. Frank finally turned around, his expression unreadable. "Son," he said quietly, "you don't owe me any explanations. You made your feelings clear. I'll find somewhere else to shop." "No," Derek said, the word coming out louder than he intended. Several customers who had been heading for the door stopped and turned back, sensing that the drama wasn't over yet. "No, that's not what I want." "Then what do you want?" Frank asked, his voice gentle but direct. Derek opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, realizing that he didn't have a ready answer. What did he want? To go back in time and undo his cruelty? To somehow erase the shame that was eating him alive? To make everyone forget what they'd seen of his true character? "I want," Derek started, then stopped, his face contorting with the effort of honest self-examination. "I want to not be the kind of person who would say those things to you. But I don't know how to not be that person." The raw honesty of the admission seemed to surprise Derek himself. Around the store, people exchanged glances, recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Derek Hayden admitting vulnerability, confessing weakness, acknowledging that he needed help. "That's a start," Seagal said quietly. "Recognizing what you are is the first step to becoming something better." Derek looked at Seagal with something approaching desperation. "But how? How do I become better when everyone already knows what I really am?" "By choosing to be different," Seagal replied simply. "Every day, every interaction, every moment when you have to decide between selfishness and service. It's not complicated, Derek. It's just not easy." Frank had been listening to this exchange with the patience of a man who had seen young soldiers struggle with far deadlier consequences of their mistakes. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had learned hard lessons about forgiveness and redemption. "You know," Frank said slowly, "I made mistakes when I was your age too. Different mistakes, but mistakes all the same. Lost my temper with scared kids who were looking to me for leadership. Let my own fear make me impatient with boys who needed steadiness. Had to learn that being right about the small things didn't matter if I was wrong about the big things." Derek stared at Frank, struggling to reconcile this admission of imperfection with the heroic figure that had been revealed during Seagal's intervention. "But you saved all those lives. You were a hero. I was a young man doing a job that needed doing," Frank corrected gently. "Same as you're trying to do now. The difference is that I had good sergeants who showed me the right way when I got lost. Question is, are you willing to learn?" The offer of mentorship, coming from the man Derek had humiliated, was so unexpected and generous that it left Derek speechless. Around the store, customers began to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Forgiveness offered not as absolution, but as opportunity. Maya stepped forward, her face bright with hope. "Mr. Mallory," she said softly, Would you consider coming back next Saturday? Maybe we could start fresh. Maybe Derek could learn about the store the way your father would have wanted him to." Derek looked at Maya with surprise and gratitude, recognizing that she was offering him a path toward redemption that he hadn't even known existed. But before he could respond, the front door chimed, and Jason stepped back into the store, his face flushed with excitement and shame. "Mr. Hayden," Jason said breathlessly, "there are people outside. They saw the video before I deleted it. Someone else must have been recording too. It's already online." Derek's face went pale as the implications sank in. The humiliation he'd inflicted on Frank, the cruelty he'd displayed, the ugly truth about his character. It was all out there now, spreading through social media like wildfire. In a matter of hours, everyone in Timber Falls would know what kind of man he really was. "How bad is it?" Derek asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jason looked uncomfortable, glancing around the store at the faces watching him. "The comments, they're not good. People are angry. Really angry. Some are talking about boycotting the store. Others are saying you should apologize publicly or resign." The weight of consequence settled over Derek like a shroud. This wasn't just about repairing relationships with individual customers anymore. This was about whether he would have a business left to save, whether the community would give him the chance to prove he could change. Seagal watched Derek's face cycle through panic, despair, and something that might have been determination. "This is where you find out what you're really made of," he said quietly. "When the whole world is watching, when there's nowhere to hide, when the only choice left is to be the man you decide to become." Derek looked around the store at the faces of people he'd known his entire life. People who had watched him grow up. People who remembered his father's kindness and were measuring Derek against that memory. The weight of their judgment was crushing, but underneath it, he sensed something else, the possibility of redemption, if he was brave enough to reach for it. The parking lot beckoned through the front windows, full of people waiting to see what Derek Hayden would do next. The choice was his: retreat into defensive anger and self-pity, or step outside and face the consequences of his actions like the man his father had hoped he would become. By evening, the video of Derek's meltdown had spread far beyond Timber Falls. Social media algorithms, hungry for content that generated strong emotional responses, had picked up the footage and amplified it across platforms. What had started as a local incident in a small mountain town had become a viral moment, with thousands of strangers weighing in on Derek's behavior and Frank's dignity. Derek sat alone in the empty hardware store, the lights dimmed, surrounded by the familiar inventory that suddenly felt foreign and hostile. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications, comments, shares, direct messages from people he'd never met telling him exactly what they thought of his character. He'd stopped reading them hours ago, but he couldn't bring himself to turn the phone off completely. The day's receipts lay scattered on the counter beside him, a meager collection that told the story of his humiliation in stark financial terms. Word had spread quickly through Timber Falls, and the afternoon had brought a steady stream of customers returning items, closing accounts, and making it clear that they would be taking their business elsewhere. Mrs. Chun had come in personally to tell him that her family's construction company would no longer be ordering supplies through Hayden's. The Martinez insurance office had canceled their standing order for office supplies. Even the coffee shop next door had quietly removed the small sign that had directed customers to the hardware store for basic maintenance needs. Maya had stayed until closing time, her loyalty warring with her moral compass as she watched Derek's world crumble around him. She'd answered the phone with increasing discomfort as reporters from regional newspapers called seeking comment on the veteran humiliation video that was trending on Twitter. Each call forced her to relive the shame of what had happened, to explain and defend a situation that had no defense. "Derek," she said quietly as she prepared to leave, "I need to tell you something." Derek looked up from his phone, his eyes red-rimmed and haunted. "If you're quitting, I understand. I know I've made your job impossible." Maya paused, studying his face. The arrogant young man who had humiliated Frank Mallory seemed to have disappeared, replaced by someone who looked lost and broken. "I'm not quitting," she said slowly. "But I need to know that today was a wake-up call for you. I need to know that you understand what you did wrong." "I humiliated a war hero in front of half the town," Derek said flatly. "I called his service irrelevant. I mocked his age and his injuries. I treated him like garbage because it made me feel powerful." His voice cracked slightly. "I became exactly the kind of person my father would have despised." The raw honesty of his self-assessment surprised Maya. She'd expected defensiveness, justification, perhaps an attempt to minimize his actions. Instead, she was seeing something that looked like genuine remorse. "Your father would have been disappointed," Maya agreed quietly. "But he also would have believed you could do better. The question is, do you believe it?" Derek was quiet for a long moment, staring at the front door through which Frank had walked with such dignity despite the cruelty he'd endured. "I don't know," he said finally. "I don't know if I can be the person this store needs me to be. I don't know if the town will ever forgive me. I don't know if I deserve forgiveness." "Maybe those aren't the right questions," Maya suggested. "Maybe the question is, what are you going to do tomorrow? And the day after that? And every day until people see that you've changed?" Across town, Frank sat on his front porch, the new brackets still in their plastic bag beside his chair. The porch steps remained unrepaired, their loose boards creaking ominously whenever the evening breeze stirred them. But Frank found himself unable to focus on the simple home maintenance task that had started his day. Instead, he stared out at the mountain vista beyond his small yard, wrestling with emotions he'd thought he'd learned to control decades ago. The humiliation stung, but not in the way it might have when he was younger. At 73, Frank had developed a philosophical acceptance of other people's ignorance and cruelty. What bothered him more was the waste of it all, the loss of a gathering place that had meant so much to the community, the damage to relationships that had taken years to build, the pain that Derek's actions would cause to people who had done nothing to deserve it. His phone had been ringing all evening with calls from friends and neighbors who had seen the video or heard about the incident secondhand. Each conversation followed the same pattern: expressions of outrage on his behalf, offers of support, suggestions that he should sue Derek or the store or demand some kind of public apology. Frank had declined all such suggestions with the same patient firmness he'd shown at the store. "It's done," he told each caller. "No point in making it worse than it already is." But privately, Frank wondered if it really was done. The young man who had treated him so cruelly was clearly struggling with demons that went far deeper than simple arrogance. Frank had seen that look before, in the eyes of young soldiers who had lost their way and didn't know how to find it again. The question was whether Derek had the courage to face those demons or whether he would let them destroy him. Steven Seagal had driven to a quiet overlook above Timber Falls, where he could see the lights of the town spread out below him like stars fallen to earth. His rental car's radio played softly as he reflected on the day's events and his role in them. He'd come to Timber Falls to teach a weekend Aikido seminar, expecting nothing more than a few days of instruction and meditation in beautiful mountain surroundings. Instead, he'd found himself in the middle of a community crisis that would have lasting consequences for everyone involved. In his years of teaching martial arts, Seagal had learned that true strength was often revealed not in moments of physical confrontation, but in moments of moral choice. Today, he'd watched a young man make the wrong choice, repeatedly and publicly, until the weight of his failures had crushed him. But he'd also seen glimpses of something better in Derek, moments of vulnerability and honesty that suggested the possibility of redemption. The real test would come in the days and weeks ahead, when the cameras were gone and the social media storm had moved on to other targets. Would Derek find the strength to rebuild not just his business, but his character? Would the community find the wisdom to offer him the chance to prove himself? Would Frank's example of grace under pressure inspire others to choose forgiveness over revenge? As Seagal sat in the gathering darkness, he thought about the circular nature of respect and dignity. Frank had earned his through service and sacrifice, carrying himself with quiet honor even when others failed to recognize it. Derek would have to earn his the same way, through consistent, daily choices to be better than he had been. The community would have to decide whether they believed in redemption strongly enough to give him that chance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The media attention would intensify before it faded. Derek would have to face customers who had seen him at his worst. Frank would have to decide whether to accept the apology that Derek clearly owed him. And Maya would have to choose whether to invest her energy in helping Derek become the man the store needed, or to cut her losses and find work somewhere else. But tonight, in the quiet aftermath of a day that had changed everything, three men sat in their separate spaces, each grappling with questions that had no easy answers. The story was far from over, but the foundation for whatever came next had been laid in the moments when a young man's cruelty met an old soldier's dignity, and a community was forced to confront its own values in the harsh light of viral scrutiny. The mountain stood eternal and patient above Timber Falls, having witnessed countless human dramas play out in the valleys below. Time would tell whether this particular story would end in redemption or ruin, but the possibilities for both remained alive in the crisp mountain air. 7 days had passed since the incident that would forever divide time in Timber Falls into before and after. Derek had spent those days in a kind of purgatory, watching his business hemorrhage customers while wrestling with the question of whether redemption was possible or if he should simply cut his losses and disappear. The answer came to him on a gray Tuesday morning as he sat in the empty store, staring at a stack of unpaid invoices and wondering how long he could keep the lights on. Through the front window, he watched Mrs. Patterson struggle with a heavy bag of mulch outside the garden center across the street, her arthritic hands unable to get a proper grip on the unwieldy package. Without thinking, Derek found himself moving toward the door, crossing the street, and taking the bag from her surprised hands. "Let me help you with that, Mrs. Patterson," he said quietly, carrying the mulch to her car and loading it into the trunk. The elderly woman stared at him with a mixture of suspicion and confusion. "Thank you," she said carefully, as if the words might be a trap. "Mrs. Patterson," Derek said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I owe you an apology. I owe everyone an apology. But I wanted to start with you because you've been shopping at our store since before I was born, and you deserve better than what I've become." The woman studied his face, seeing something she hadn't expected, genuine remorse mixed with the kind of vulnerability that couldn't be faked. "Your father was a good man, Derek," she said finally. "He would have wanted you to do better." "I know," Derek replied. "That's what I'm trying to figure out how to do." That afternoon, Derek made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He printed a simple flyer and spent 3 hours walking through Timber Falls, taping it to telephone poles, leaving copies at the coffee shop and the post office, and personally delivering it to every business on Main Street. The flyer was brief and direct. Saturday morning veterans coffee, 8 a.m. at Hayden's Hardware. All veterans and their families welcome. Coffee and donuts provided. A return to tradition. Maya found him hanging the last flyer on the community bulletin board outside the library. Derek, she said, her voice uncertain, are you sure about this? What if nobody comes? What if it makes things worse? Derek secured the flyer with a thumbtack and stepped back, his expression thoughtful. Then at least I'll have tried to do something right. My father used to host these every Saturday morning for 20 years. Maybe it's time I learned why that mattered to him. What if Mr. Mallory doesn't come? Maya asked gently. Then I'll understand why, Derek replied. But I'm going to make the coffee anyway. And I'm going to keep making it every Saturday until I either figure out how to be the man this store needs or until I have to close the doors. Friday evening found Derek in the store after hours, cleaning with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He scrubbed floors that were already clean, organized inventory that was already organized, and set up a coffee station in the back corner where his father's old percolator had gathered dust for 2 years. Maya arrived early Saturday morning to find Derek already there, wearing his father's old apron and carefully arranging store-bought donuts on paper plates. His hands shook slightly as he measured coffee grounds, and she could see the anxiety written in every line of his body. Smells good, she said softly, trying to inject some normalcy into the moment. Tastes terrible, Derek admitted with a nervous laugh. I never learned how to make coffee the way Dad did. He always said it was about patience and respect for the process, but I was never interested in learning. At 7:55 a.m., Derek unlocked the front door and flipped the sign to open. The store was empty except for him and Maya, the coffee growing stronger by the minute, the donuts sitting untouched on their plates. Derek stood behind the counter, trying to project confidence he didn't feel, while Maya busied herself with unnecessary tasks to avoid watching the clock. At 8:03, the door chimed. Derek's heart leaped, then sank as he saw it was just Mrs. Chun picking up a forgotten item from the previous day. She nodded politely but didn't approach the coffee station. At 8:07, the door chimed again. This time, it was Hector Alvarez, looking uncomfortable but determined. He glanced around the empty store, then walked slowly toward the back corner where Derek waited. Coffee smells strong, Hector said carefully. Too strong, probably, Derek admitted. I'm still learning. Hector poured himself a cup and took a tentative sip. It's not bad, he said diplomatically. Different from how your father made it. But not bad. They stood in awkward silence for several minutes. Two men trying to navigate the uncertain territory between conflict and reconciliation. Finally, Hector spoke again. Your father used to tell stories about the men who built this town, he said quietly. Loggers and miners, mostly. Hard men who did hard work and didn't ask for much except to be treated with dignity. He understood that respect wasn't something you demanded, it was something you earned by giving it. Derek nodded, his throat tight with emotion. I forgot that. Somewhere along the way, I forgot everything he tried to teach me. At 8:15, the door chimed again, and Derek's breath caught in his throat. Frank Mallory stood in the doorway, his weathered face unreadable, his wooden cane gripping firmly in his hand. He paused for a moment, surveying the store that had been the scene of his humiliation just 1 week earlier. Behind Frank came Mr. Richmond, moving slowly with his walker, followed by two men Derek didn't recognize, one middle-aged with the bearing of a soldier, the other elderly but still strong-looking. Maya felt tears spring to her eyes as she realized Frank hadn't come alone. He'd brought reinforcements, other veterans who were willing to take a chance on Derek's attempt at redemption. Frank approached the coffee station with careful dignity, his pale blue eyes meeting Derek's directly. Morning, he said simply. Mr. Mallory, Derek began, his voice thick with emotion. Coffee first, Frank interrupted gently. Apologies second. That was always your father's rule. Derek poured coffee with shaking hands, spilling slightly as he passed the cup to Frank. The old soldier accepted it with a slight nod, then took a careful sip. Strong, Frank observed. Too strong, Derek admitted again. Your father made it strong too. First few years, Frank said with something that might have been a small smile. He learned that different people like different things. Part of being a good host is paying attention to your guests. The simple lesson, delivered without judgment or cruelty, hit Derek harder than any angry words could have. He was being offered instruction, not condemnation, a chance to learn rather than simply be punished. As the morning progressed, more people arrived. Some came out of curiosity, others out of loyalty to Frank, and a few out of genuine willingness to give Derek another chance. The coffee station became a small island of tentative community in the vast ocean of Derek's mistakes. Derek mostly listened, serving coffee and donuts while the veterans shared stories and gentle laughter. He was learning something his father had tried to teach him years ago, that a business wasn't just about transactions, but about relationships. That respect wasn't demanded but cultivated. That redemption was possible, but only through consistent, daily choices to be better than you had been. When Steven Seagal appeared in the doorway at 9:30, Derek felt his stomach clench with anxiety. But the martial arts instructor simply approached the coffee station, accepted a cup, and found a place in the circle of chairs that had somehow formed around the old percolator. "Good coffee," Seagal said quietly, his pale eyes meeting Derek's. "Your father would be proud." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of possibility. Derek had taken the first steps on a long journey toward redemption, and while the destination was far from certain, the path was finally becoming clear. 3 months later, the Saturday morning Veterans Coffee had become the most popular gathering in Timber Falls. What had started as Derek's desperate attempt at redemption had grown into something larger, a weekly celebration of service, community, and the quiet heroism that often went unrecognized in everyday life. The store itself had been transformed. Where once there had been an atmosphere of barely controlled chaos and customer irritation, now there was something that felt like the old Hayden's hardware that longtime residents remembered. Derek had learned to slow down, to listen, to treat each customer as if their business mattered, because it did. The financial recovery had been slow but steady. Some customers had returned grudgingly, others out of genuine forgiveness, and a few new ones had been drawn by word of mouth about the young store owner who was working hard to make amends for his mistakes. The viral video that had nearly destroyed Derek's reputation had eventually been overshadowed by newer social media controversies, but its lessons remained burned into his memory. On this particular Saturday morning, Derek stood behind the coffee station with the easy confidence of someone who had finally learned his father's secret recipe, not just for coffee, but for community. The store buzzed with conversation as veterans from 3 different wars shared stories with younger residents who listened with newfound appreciation for the sacrifices that had been made on their behalf. Frank sat in his usual spot near the window, his wooden cane propped against his chair as he examined a faded photograph that Hector had brought to share. The picture showed a group of young soldiers in Vietnam, their faces bright with youth and innocence that would soon be tested by war. "That's Tommy Chun," Frank said, pointing to a skinny kid in the back row. "Dorothy's husband. Good soldier. Better man." Derek approached with a fresh cup of coffee, made exactly the way Frank preferred it, strong but not bitter, with just a touch of cream. Over the past months, Derek had learned each veteran's preferences with the same attention to detail that his father had once shown. "Mr. Mallory," Derek said quietly, "I have something for you." Frank looked up with curiosity as Derek handed him a small wooden plaque. The inscription was simple but meaningful: Frank Doc Mallory, Vietnam veteran, combat medic, community hero. Respect is earned through service, honor through sacrifice. Frank's weathered fingers traced the letters slowly, his pale blue eyes bright with emotion. "Derek," he said softly, this is very kind. But you didn't need to." "Yes, I did," Derek interrupted gently. "I needed to find a way to say what I should have said 3 months ago. I needed to honor what you've given to this community. And I needed to remind myself every day what real strength looks like." Around the coffee station, conversations had grown quieter as people became aware of the moment unfolding between the young store owner and the old soldier. Maya wiped tears from her eyes as she watched Derek kneel beside Frank's chair, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was wrong about everything," Derek said. "I thought strength meant making other people feel small. I thought respect was something you could demand instead of earn. I thought your service was ancient history instead of the foundation that everything else was built on. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Frank studied Derek's face for a long moment, seeing something there that reminded him of the scared young soldiers he'd once treated in field hospitals. Boys who had made mistakes but were trying desperately to learn from them. "Apology accepted," Frank said simply. "Now the question is, what are you going to do with the lesson?" "I'm going to keep learning," Derek replied. "From you, from everyone in this room, from my father's memory. I'm going to try to be worthy of this store and this community. Steven Seagal, who had become a regular visitor to the Saturday coffee gatherings, approached the group with his characteristic quiet grace. Over the past months, he had watched Derek's transformation with the patience of someone who understood that real change took time and consistent effort. "Derek," Seagal said, his voice carrying the calm authority that Derek had learned to respect, "do you remember what I told you about choosing who you become?" Derek nodded. "Every day, every interaction, every moment when you have to decide between selfishness and service. And what have you learned about that choice?" Derek considered the question carefully, looking around the room at faces that had become familiar, voices that had become valued, stories that had become part of his own understanding of what community meant. "I've learned that it's not one choice," Derek said slowly. "It's 1,000 small choices. It's choosing to listen instead of talk. It's choosing to serve instead of demand. It's choosing to see people as they really are instead of as obstacles to what I want." Seagal smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "Your father would be proud," he said simply. As the morning wound down and people began to drift away, Derek stood behind the counter watching the familiar Saturday routine. Mr. Richmond struggled to his feet with the help of his walker, pausing to shake Derek's hand with genuine warmth. Hector clapped Derek on the shoulder, their friendship slowly rebuilding on the foundation of mutual respect. Maya organized the coffee station with the efficiency of someone who truly loved her work. Frank was among the last to leave, moving slowly but steadily toward the door. As he reached for the handle, Derek called out one last time. "Mr. Mallory," Derek said, "will you be here next Saturday?" Frank turned back with what might have been a small smile. "Wouldn't miss it," he said. "Someone's got to make sure you don't let that coffee get too strong." After everyone had gone and the store was quiet again, Derek sat alone among the empty coffee cups and crumb-scattered plates, thinking about the journey that had brought him to this moment. The viral video that had nearly destroyed him was still out there somewhere in the digital ether, a permanent record of his worst moment. But it had been overshadowed by something more powerful, the daily evidence of his commitment to becoming better. Maya finished cleaning the coffee station and gathered her things to leave. "Derek," she said as she reached the door, "your father really would be proud. Not because you're perfect, but because you never stopped trying to improve." Alone in the store his father had built, Derek looked around at the familiar inventory and tools, the old wooden floors and hand-lettered signs. But more importantly, he saw the invisible connections that made it all meaningful. The trust slowly rebuilt, the community gradually healed, the legacy finally honored. He thought about Steven Seagal's words about choosing who you become, and realized that the choice was never finished. Every day brought new opportunities to serve instead of demand, to listen instead of lecture, to see people as complete human beings instead of obstacles or opportunities. Outside, the mountain stood eternal and patient above Timber Falls, having witnessed another human drama play out in the valley below. This particular story had ended not in ruin, but in quiet redemption, proving that even the deepest wounds could heal when people chose grace over grudges, understanding over anger, and hope over despair. Derek locked the door and headed home, already thinking about next Saturday's coffee and the continuing work of becoming the man his father had hoped he could be. The transformation was far from complete, but the foundation was solid, built on the bedrock of respect earned through service and honor maintained through daily choice. In a small mountain town where time moved differently for different generations, one young man had learned that real strength wasn't about making others feel small, but about lifting them up. It was a lesson that would serve him well for the rest of his life, and one that would echo through the community long after the last cup of Saturday morning coffee had been poured. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.